90-Day Fiancé. Before the 90 Days star Brian Muniz has not told his girlfriend Ingrid the whole story of how he ended up in a wheelchair. Brian is a 52-year-old man from Illinois who is in a relationship with single mom Ingrid, 32, from Brazil. Brian is considered a quadriplegic because his injury affected all four of his limbs. Brian lost his ability to walk after a carjacking incident. However, he has not told Ingrid about his past and hopes she can handle it. Brian can only feel half of his arm because of the injury. Brian can move his legs but not enough to walk. Brian has atrophy in his hand, so he doesn't have the muscle to close it and can't grab anything. Brian also gets leg spasms because of the shortening of the tendons in his legs. Brian has been married 4 times, and he met Ingrid 2 years ago. They spoke to each other every day and hit it off right away. Brian thinks he chose wrong in the past and Ingrid is very different. He thinks there's a very high chance that Ingrid is the one. Brian grew up in Chicago, inner city. His father wasn't around much, and he was raised by his mom. She did the best she could, but it was a constant struggle for her. Brian married his high school sweetheart when he was 19. Brian welcomed a daughter named Brianna with his first wife. He was married for 3 years before getting divorced. Brianna was everything to Brian, so he did everything to support her. However, one day, his whole world turned upside down. Brian said he was approaching his 25th anniversary of being in a wheelchair. He spoke about how he was shot with a small caliber handgun when he was 27 years old. It hit him in the spinal cord and left him quadriplegic. Brian said that, unfortunately, where he is from, gun violence is not uncommon. Brian said that 2 men were waiting for him as he came home one day. One of the men crossed the street to his car and asked him to get out. The man told Brian that he had a gun. However, Brian wasn't scared because he was a young guy from the inner city. He thought he could grab the man and get away from the situation. But he got shot, and it was instant paralysis from the chest down. Once he was taken to the hospital, Brian's doctor told him that he now had to start over. The doctor informed Brian that, apart from the fact that he would never be able to walk again, his hands were also never going to work the same again. According to Starcasm, Brian was featured as a guest on the Charlie Smith Speaks podcast where he spoke about the carjacking event. Brian's father trained him to become a boxer. As per Brian, his neighborhood only had gangs and drugs and he was inspired to be either a ball player, a boxer, or a drug dealer. He was mafia and that got me, that was in my head. I'm mafia. I'm mafioso. I'm from mafia family, Brian said about his grandfather. Brian smoked marijuana at 16 and dropped out of high school. After briefly living in California and Oklahoma, he returned to Chicago where he started selling weed to make some money while working as a file clerk at an insurance company. He was married by now and had also welcomed Brianna into his life. However, Brian soon started doing cocaine. His marriage fell apart when he started missing work and cheating on his ex-wife. Brian seemingly married an older lady who later was a cocaine supplier, but he soon moved out. Brian claims that the man who shot him was sent by this drug supplier woman. Brian thought of his injury as something that gave him a new birth. He adjusted to it and found new ways to be active again. He was introduced to wheelchair rugby, and it turned everything around for Brian. He eventually made it to the USA team and started playing internationally for almost 4 years. Brian went to India, Argentina, Denmark, and Switzerland. He also went to Brazil and fell in love with the place. After playing there for several years, he took on a coaching role and became fluent in Portuguese. Brian found it easier to date in Brazil than in the US. He thought the attitude people have towards men in wheelchairs like him is like they're just like last resort. He experienced that Brazilian women were much more open to disability. Brian had been in several relationships in Brazil, including a failed marriage, and wondered if real love wasn't on the cards for him. It remains to be seen if Ingrid will accept that Brian hid such a big part of his journey from her once he opens up about it on 90 Day Fiancé before the 90 days.